think I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling because we've got a lot to cover. Okay. All right, folks. I know there's still some people kind of filtering in, and we'll go ahead and get started because we've got a lot of good information to cover this morning, and we'll just kind of let people filter in as they will. My name is Zach Reinhardt. I'm with First West Roads Bank. I'll be moderating the discussion today. I'm going to keep these opening remarks real brief. We've got a great panel. They're going to come up and share just a little bit of information to kind of set the stage and lay a foundation for the conversation we're going to have this morning. Title of the talk is Transportation Transformation, talking about the impact of changes and improvements in public transportation on the commercial real estate industry. There's a lot of questions surrounding this topic, and so we're going to try to answer those questions. If you have questions towards the end, if we have some time, we'll take those questions. We've got a great list of questions here to kind of prompt our speakers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Derek Smith, and he's going to kind of and he's going to kind of get it going. We've got Derek Miller and Ken Smith from the city, Lauren Sensick from Metro Transit, Jeff Spees from MAPA, Jerry Reimer with Urban Village, and Mike Moylan with Shamrock Development.
Thanks, Zach. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start pretty high level and get right into it. And you said a little bit of detail. Unfortunately, this is probably a lot of detail, so we're going to go through it really quick. So as a basis at the city, what we follow is the master plan, and everything we do must follow the master plan. And it's all based upon a high quality of life for all of our citizens. And there's a few key goals in this issue of transportation, specifically transit, as far as growth of the city, a positive city image, diverse neighborhoods, and providing public services efficiently and effectively. As far as citywide development, at the city, we like to see growth at the western fringe as well as in our urban core and throughout all of our neighborhoods. So we facilitate that process through investments and incentives. And it's really about creating great places, and transit could be a key factor in this. And a good example of that is the mid-1970s, the city itself went through the effort and created the downtown plan that brought life back into downtown. Shortly after the Woodman built the tower, the iconic tower in downtown. And through those efforts, what we see out there today doesn't look like this, but a lot of the key elements are there. Specifically talking about transit and early studies. And this is where what the World Herald loves to see is pictures like this. On the bottom left, that's an old streetcar in Omaha, and they like to call it a trolley. Early studies basically looked at streetcars more on that trolley-esque and connecting destinations for tourists, and it really didn't meet the goals of the city. Didn't really help build our community, help build the downtown that we needed to have. And actually, here's a route of the mid-1990s map connecting then Rosenblatt to downtown. And then there was actually some ideas on BRT many years ago, utilizing the beltway that runs through Midtown. Fast forward to 2009, the downtown plan. The idea here was to create the next evolution of downtown and what it could look like in the future and what it needs to look like in the future. And this is the idea of streetcar and transit came into the conversation again, not only in our minds, but also the public kept asking about those ideas of enhanced transit in the community. And then later on, when we developed the environment element and the transportation element, the idea of bus rapid transit was placed in our policy as an idea of how to enhance and better enhance our community. And then moving from that level, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff to talk about the regional transit vision.
Good morning. I want to talk briefly about the Regional Transit Vision, or the RTV, and where that came from. First step is Heartland 2050. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a high-level, long-range vision for how we may grow in the future. There's 8 counties, both sides of the Missouri River, and sort of based on the expected population growth and what it will take to attract new people to the region to get to that expected growth of somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5 million people by 2050. And it's supported by MAPPA, but it's intended to be really have a lot of ownership from people in the region. And it's been an exercise in leadership development to get people to think in a regional way. And so we wanted to think about this in terms of people, places, and resources. And it's been led by a steering committee, a lot of public input, scientific surveys, and looking at anything from education, which MAPPA is not working in, but want to support the people that are, to come up with some high-level goals and strategies to achieve a high quality of life. And so one of those steps on the public input was we have this survey that we did, that 3 times as many people supported infill development versus growing in areas that are not developed today. And so that was really a point for us to push on the regional transit vision, that developing inside the city would really help to support the density and create good places that transit can succeed in. So this is just an example of I'm not sure how easy that is to read, but so the current funding that Metro has compared to the peer cities, and so despite that low level of funding compared to other cities, they develop and run a rather successful transit system. So how do we support that in the future and build and expand on that? So the regional transit vision is really an opportunity to identify high-level goals that we can develop in phases that create good places and use transit as a link to get people to have those choices. So if Heartland 2050 is about people, places, and resources, the regional transit vision is people, places, and choices. So we want to really identify corridors that are important to advance and make transit successful, come up with some funding strategies to make those work, and what the land use is necessary to make those places work. So the first phase of the regional transit vision is the bus rapid transit and the urban circulator. And so this goes from downtown, and Lauren will be able to talk much more intelligently on the bus rapid transit system, but downtown out to West Roads Mall, and then the circulators, Midtown, back to downtown. The second phase of that is to connect the north-south corridors from Metro Fort Campus down to South Campus, and then to expand around Saddle Creek as well. The third phase of that is really to expand on the trunk, all the way out to Elkhorn through Metro Community College, Village Point, and then down south to Shadow Lake. So as we find places to redevelop and support good places to give people a choice of where they want to live and work, and support the density that is needed to make transit work. The last phase of this is just some express routes that could be phased in later on out to satellite communities like Fremont or Glenwood, and head down to Offutt Air Force Base. So really strong transit plus development is what equals community success, and that's what we've really tried to push on the regional transit vision and allow it to be a big picture vision. Then the circulator and the BRT can really be the things to achieve that transit vision. So now I'll pass it back over to Derek.
So as stated, the first part of this process was to look at what is called an alternatives analysis, and we've been through this process over the last 3 years, and I kept saying AA, and people thought I had a problem. But so the whole idea here is looking at that corridor between it. Initially looked at downtown, connecting it to the Med Center, but then we expanded it to Crossroads with all the anticipation of development happening there, and then Lauren will talk more about future extensions off of that. But the whole idea here is to follow a federal process to put us in line for federal funding. And to do that for both transit and road projects, you have to develop a purpose and need, look at various alternatives as far as routes and as well as technologies. And we started with enhanced bus, urban circulator, and bus rapid transit. So these were all the routes connecting downtown, north downtown to midtown, out to Crossroads and down to Exarban Village. We narrowed that down basically north downtown to the Med Center and on out to Crossroads, and it's been further refined from here, and again there'll be further iterations of refining it even more. Throughout the whole process, as we do for all of our projects, there was quite a bit of public engagement, quite a bit of public meetings, and many people showed up throughout the process. We had 4 major public meetings, and we had rooms like this, so it was refreshing for me to see that we had that much participation and support for the projects. One key aspect that we looked at that will be applicable to this summit is the idea of economic development and development that transit can create. We're seeing this nationally, and we'll see it locally. What we had the S.B. Friedman, the consultant, do is look at the entire region as far as what they see as far as future growth over the next 15 years, looked at the share in our corridor, and then looked at other communities that have transit options that we're looking at, and then applied a multiplier factor to that. And what we found with the BRT system, basically 1,200 jobs, 1,600 population, and additional 300 million in development. For urban circulator, modern streetcar, we saw 8,500 jobs, 3,100 additional population, and $1 billion in development. And again, these are just general numbers, but it's what came back out after the market analysis. So it does show that impact that transit can have on our community that we're seeing nationally. And this is all backed by trends and preferences that are occurring throughout the community and throughout the country. What we ended up with was a locally preferred alternative. That's the federal jargon for what we picked and what the community picked. And both BRT and modern streetcar, urban circulator were pushed forward, and these are the numbers on that. I'm sure that the bottom, second to bottom row concerns a few people, but that's the type of level of investment that you need to see to get a huge return on investment. And that's what is in line with a lot of other communities and what they've done. And we'll move on to bus rapid transit because this is a real project. This is happening.
Okay. Thank you. So as Derek mentioned, one of the products that came out of the alternative analysis is rapid transit, or BRT for short. In transportation, there's quite a few acronyms, so I apologize if we use too many of them up here. But what BRT really is it's a enhanced transit product that is really meant to look, feel, and operate like rail, but using buses. There's a number of different treatments that it receives, as well as a really special, unique branding to really make this a high-quality, high-end product. And that, this will be the first BRT in Omaha that we actually are just lucky enough to receive some federal funding for, so it's in project development now. Our route, as Derek mentioned a little bit, is from West Roads to 10th Street in downtown, running along Dodge Street. And there'll be a number of stops and stations along the route, but they are spaced out much further than local bus service to really make it that rapid transit product. And I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly because I know we're pretty short on time, but I imagine there'll be questions after. So, Omaha's rapid transit project is about 8 miles long. It's going to include quite a few technology and infrastructure improvements to actually make it that high-end product. We're expecting over 2,700 riders opening day, and to generate about $450 million in new development over and beyond the baseline of what would occur without this investment, as well as brings jobs and new residents to this corridor. In addition to that responsible growth, the BRT is also going to bring about enhanced mobility throughout this corridor. It will become a part of the overall transportation network solution, and also it's an important part of social equity, as 16% of the households along this corridor don't have access to a car. So really what makes the BRT something special, rapid transit, rather than just a bus, is really its reliability and high-end customer service. It also has rapid service that travels very quickly along the corridor. We're anticipating about a 15-minute time savings over regular transit service. It'll operate every 10 minutes during the peak period, and will be very convenient and easy to understand. BRT also is a very high-level premium service, both through its branding and the products that it offers. And I'm a little thrown off here because their slides are not my final version here, but that's okay, I'm working through it. Technology is an important part of what makes BRT successful, both in terms of fare collection, speed up boarding. It receives priority treatments at intersections with red lights to make it faster. There'll be high-end amenities like real-time arrival signage, Wi-Fi available for passengers along the corridor. And branding's really important. It's going to look and feel different. It's going to be branded as a rail product and have that sense of permanency and investment in this corridor and in this community. Vehicles will be very high-end, and they're going to offer what we call level boarding by building a platform at the station locations that will allow people to walk onto the vehicle without, for something like a wheelchair access, we won't need to deploy a wheelchair ramp, and it really will speed up that process and make it just like you would think of a train station, like a light rail or subway system. It's that same walking onto the vehicle type of system. It's going to have a combination of different treatments, including running in mixed traffic with vehicular traffic. It'll have an exclusive lane along part of the route, as well as semi-exclusive lanes where it's shared with cars turning right. The stations are going to be an important component. They're going to be very high-end. We want them to look and feel different. These aren't bus stops slapped on the corner, and with a number of different amenities for passenger comfort and convenience. Access to the stations is going to be important. We'll be looking at pedestrian and bicycle connections as well as we go through this process. And there's just some examples of what some other places have done in terms of platform. There'll be a number of different treatments based on the physical constraints and right-of-way we have available throughout this corridor, but it's going to have that consistent feel, but applied to a very local, specific context. And some pictures. Like I said, my slides are a little out of order. Sorry about that. But real-time arrival information will show that the next vehicle is arriving in 5 minutes. It'll sell fare at the stations before you get board the BRT vehicle. Lighting will be important. Public art. They're really going to be high-end additions to the community. So we're really excited about that. As I mentioned, we received federal funding for this project, although we're still working on the project. It's in project development now, and we actually expect to begin construction in 2017 and have it up and running by 2018. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Derek so he can talk about urban circulator or modern streetcar.
So on to modern streetcar. Again, this is a rail vehicle on rails. The occupancy is much higher than most typical transit systems. It has the preferential treatments, much like BRT. Again, up to 160 passengers. This usually and typically runs in mixed traffic, but it can have dedicated transit lanes, and it's run by overhead electric service through the Canton area. These are some images of Portland and Seattle, and the stops themselves are not as big and not as have all the characteristics of light rail or BRT. It's more about the vehicle themselves and the rail in the ground that provides that permanency that the vehicle is going to be there. Payment systems can be off the vehicle or on the vehicle. It can be work in both ways. BRT is ahead of urban circulator at this point, so we don't have all the details worked out as far as the route, but generally this is the route from north downtown along 10th Street, utilizing Harney and Farnham out to the Med Center and possibly even down to Saddle Creek. The thing to note here is the idea about streetcars has been taking hold for quite a bit of time in our country. These are all the committed projects throughout the country and operating projects, and these are all the streetcar projects, urban circular projects that are in planning stages. Of course, everyone talks about Portland. I don't like to talk about Portland because that's not very applicable to Omaha, but Portland. There are other communities. Seattle likes to compete with Portland, and in Seattle they're running South Lake Union streetcar and have been for quite a while now. A lot of help with Paul Allen. Sacramento just got funded from a federal grant. Minneapolis is working on it. Milwaukee just sent out RFP for their train sets. Detroit, of all places, you wouldn't think that they'd be working on a project like this, but in Detroit, M1 Rail is being funded in a great amount by the philanthropic community. DC is under testing phases right now. Atlanta streetcar has been operational since January, and actually, yeah, since January or maybe December. I wouldn't look at that project. It's not a very good example. Tucson streetcar, the first picture on the front of the slideshow, is a great example. Much success, over $1 billion already in development that has occurred, either directly or indirectly attributable to the project. And then just down the interstate in Kansas City, they have 70% of the tracks in the ground, and they're over $1 billion in development. These are all old numbers. 2014 of January 2014, but we're seeing it. You could talk to your peers down in Kansas City. Kansas City also has 2 BRT lines currently running, so that's another transit option down there that's being provided in our peer community, and I think we can compete against Kansas City. So I'm quite jealous that they're ahead of us in both BRT and streetcar. So what it comes down to, it's physical and economic. It's economic because it creates development on both sides, both BRT and streetcar. It's also a physical side, and we could talk more about that through questions you may have. So density plus connectivity equals vibrancy. Our downtown won't become what it needs to become without a viable transit option or a package of transit options. And it comes down to parking, and that's where I'm going to turn it over to Ken. But before I do that, one quick example, here's Denver. It doesn't look like this today, but you look at that. I see a lot of underutilized real estate that has been impacted by transit. So this is Omaha. We have a lot of parking. It's a great asset to have, but again, a lot of underutilized real estate that we can better utilize than it is in its current state. So with that introduction to Ken, you can talk about parking.
I was wondering how we're going to segue from transportation to parking, but thank you. So what we've been doing is obviously taking a step back and looking into history, what parking's been like. And as you can see, this is prior World War II and where we're at. There was a lot of transportation, public transportation that is, which really, and the car still wasn't there. And of course, as we move ahead into the future, you can see parking just blossomed there. We had all our veterans from World War II coming back, and they all purchased cars. And so parking's really taken over the downtown from that standpoint. We've done some studies recently as 2014. The first study back in 2011, though, identified that we have more than adequate enough parking within the downtown if you count the areas and what we're doing at any one time. At our peak times during the downtown, we're only occupying about 55% of our spaces. And if you consider the numbers there, that's about 20,000 spaces that are left open on a daily basis. And building parking garages are not cheap. They're $20,000 a space, so do some quick math there. It adds up pretty quick. So really the issue comes down to we have a perception issue when it comes to parking. Some of the things we're going to look to in the future is kind of minimize some of that frustration, make parking easy to find. There's certainly a disconnect there with it in the transportation system. I think there are a lot of questions on what you pay and what's expected to pay. There's obviously always safety and security issues. We got to maximize what our facilities are out there, our built environment, and see what we can do for efficiency within those. Balance option within the rates. That's between the on-street and off-street, and we need to come up with a plan that kind of gets those spaces on the street open and move them into the parking garage. We have a partners program that I'm going to go into here later, and we'll talk about the parking enterprise fund now is off the tax rolls of the general fund. In the past, there was a large subsidy from the general fund to the parking facilities to continue operation. As Lauren mentioned, it all comes down to branding the P. So we are looking at doing that. We're going to kind of help facilitate that positive experience, making it easier to identify where public parking is. And that's not just with our sites, the garages that the city owns, but other facilities will hopefully do that too. All our garages, city garages, are named Park 1, Park 2, Park 3. And I think that probably came from when they were developing projects. There's Project 1, there's Parking Garage 2, and it makes sense to the guys that developed it. But from the users, it's like, okay, where's Park 1, where's 2, where's 3? I think we could look and do a better name, utilizing the street corners where the entrances are at, and maybe rename the facilities there. Some of you have seen this. We've introduced some new technology, the pay-by-phone apps on the meters. It's roughly about 20% of our the payment process out there. Cash is still the major one being utilized here, but we certainly hope to create this and continue on our success with the parking app. We're looking at making some garage improvements. Now that we're actually in the black, we're starting to identify some projects we can do within the garages. And you'll hopefully see those coming up. We got some at 15th and Douglas Garage. We got some restoration work, some lighting things coming into play, and some other things. So the biggest thing about parking is that we got to create this shared parking model. The city is guilty in itself that in the past we've negotiated these contracts in a silo. We've said, oh, here's this corporation. Here's your parking garage. Here's this corporation. Here's your parking garage. And really it limits our options from an employee standpoint, because your CEO or your GM is not going to be, yeah, I can afford $100 a month, but what about your other staff that's within their operation? So we got to kind of create this shared parking model and a market-based system and allow the system to kind of flush out the supply and demand issue. And even within the garage itself, there are different uses within a garage that we can make the garage more efficient. Certain alternating uses, even as a single employer, not everybody shows up on the same day for work. Either you're out of the office, you're sick, vacation, kid activities, whatever. And usually just within a employer, say we got 1,000 employees, you usually can see a 20 to 30% reduction in there. So it's up to us to maximize the efficiency in that garage and utilize that space when those employees are gone. This is something that we're going to be kicking off. I've been meeting with some key individuals, private partners program. Basically what this does is identify those private facilities that may have public parking. I think right now if we drive downtown, even as a parking professional, I could never find where an off-street parking facility was where I wouldn't get towed, ticketed, or something would happen. So we're going to try to create this partners program that's going to identify those facilities. We're going to do it through a website that the private owners will be able to log on to, say, hey, I got 30, 40 spaces that are open. I can market them. So we'll have a single marketplace for parking spaces. And there's a number of benefits that can come from the shared parking program, and we certainly have an uphill battle here. We got to change kind of a culture shift as far as what we've been doing in the past. When you talk about increased value of parking space, it's not how much money I'm getting from that parking space, it's the economic value that parking space can utilize. And I always like to use, for every dollar I invest in a parking space, I want to get 5 back in economic value. Certainly when we do this, we start increasing the efficiency within the garages, the system itself, and you start using less land for parking, because now those garages that had a couple hundred spaces are on the market, and they're utilized much better. So in the end, we'll start decreasing the demand for overall parking. That's the supply there. And when you start creating these options and different variabilities within parking, it allows you or gives options to the employees to do other things. So it starts supporting alternative transportation. And certainly increased development comes from it.
All right. Thank you very much for all the information there. We're going to start off the conversation talking about permanency. Wow. A lot of you guys showed up. They're talking about office furniture like across the hall. You sure? All right, cool. I was sitting here and I didn't see everybody show up, so this is great. One of the big questions that that a lot of people have about transportation is, what does it take to build a successful transportation network? So one of the questions surrounds the idea of permanency. So the big question that some people have is, there have been a lot of streetcar studies done in Omaha in the past, People might be wondering what makes the transit alternatives analysis different. What makes this process different than the ones that have happened in the past? So I guess that would be the first question I would kind of pose to the panel is, what makes this process different?
Well, a $15 million Tiger grant for the federal government is a big difference for BRT. So from the AA, again, my problem, that is a huge step forward to win those dollars. Metro did an excellent job of applying for those federal funds. We went through a great process and won those dollars. On the urban circulator side of things, I think Omaha, we're a show me kind of place. I got to see it somewhere else first. And I think, again, I'm jealous. Kansas City, 70% complete, not even up and running, and they're already over $1 billion in development and showing another option. So I think between what we've done in that AA process and what Metro did winning that grant, plus what a lot of other communities are doing outside of Portland, this is different. It's a different time. And I think we're at a point in downtown especially that I'm not sure if we're going to see a lot more development than what we have. We're actually losing employers out of downtown, and I don't like to see that. Being a city employee, downtown's a very important place to me, and that, again, that was kind of over parking, as I heard, an ugly rumor. But I think we're at a place in time now, unfortunately, it's much later than what we would like it would have been. But I think with everything else that's happened nationally and what's happening locally, I think we're right for the time to do something to move this forward.
And I would just add to that the federal funding for the BRT really is an important part of that AA. It's not, with federal funding, it's not a raise your hand and I'd like a 15 million, please. It was actually, the Tiger Grant was one of 72 projects out of 800 across the country that were applied for this funding. And they were across all modes. They were highway, aviation, ferries, transit. And so it was highly competitive, and we wouldn't have had a chance at that funding without the AA process.
Great. So there's a couple of developers on the panel here. One of the questions, that a lot of that I have, at least, we'll go that far, is what is your perception of? We've seen the map, we've seen the routes, we've heard the vehicles talked about, explained very well. What's your perception of the two modes proposed in the analysis? Do you have more confidence from one than the other? Do you see them impacting property values, rents, demand, things like that? What's your overall opinion or thoughts on that?
I think the first thing is when we started the presentation, they talked a lot about the trolley, and that was a cute little thing to move some to transport some visitors around and things like that. But the amount of effort and expertise and investment of time and now money to get it to this process of what was presented today is the key element that really makes it not only a reality, but also that there's a science to this. There's, these are exact numbers. There's a lot of investment. It's been done before in other cities. These are proven concepts. And I think early on, too, with the BRT, people thought, we're rerouting some bus routes. Well, today this just proved significantly different than that. So that shows that, while it's not quite the rails in the ground, it's still a significant investment, so developers can take a stronger look at what is happening along those corridors and evaluate their investment in parking. And then the streetcar it's all about economic development. It's going to move people around, but when you get to the level that these people and other people have spent time and effort and money to get to, it's all about economic development now, what can occur and will occur to continue the great pattern of urban development from, used to be just downtown, but, we're talking all the way out to 72nd Street now of a really solid urban corridor. And then the only other thing I would probably add from that perspective is we're talking about 5,000 parking stalls. Building 5,000 parking stalls would pay the $130 million for there's probably 5,000 parking stalls on the board today. And we oftentimes now we have to build 2 stalls per person. I got to build one for them to be at home and you got to build one for them to be downtown. Well, it's clear, and it's a fact, and it's a science that it can be shared, and no one has to be worried about being at the end of the line and saying, gee, we only built 100 stalls, and I'm at the end of the line, and I'm missing the 10 I needed. So it's a big science, and it's been a lot of professional investment to see it happen, and I think this presentation is probably one of the best I've seen. And they couldn't give it 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 12 months ago with all the extra work that's been done recently, but it clearly shows the professional investment and time to where it's a clear benefit for the community, but also for developers to be able to reevaluate how we do our projects and where we're going to put those projects.
Jerry, what are your thoughts?
Okay.
All right.
Warren Buffett and
Yeah. Okay. Great. I think that's great. One of the questions that I think brokers and investors in the room might have is: do you see an impact on property values? Do you see an impact on rents? Do you see an impact on demand from things like the streetcar or the BRT?
So I think the answer is absolutely. I also think, though, we have some other macro factors that are playing into the favor as well. I have some multifamily projects out on 192nd and Dodge right now, and then also in Midtown. And I just saw a rent study done on a price per square foot, and I was shocked at how much higher the actual rents that are being realized are at the 68105 zip code versus a West Omaha zip code. And again, for a guy who kind of grew up in West Omaha, that's not my general perception. So additional development will encourage that. One of the things that I would also, I guess, put out there for us to consider, one of the things that I do think makes Omaha great and amazing is we do have a private partner formula that seems to work. You look at the investments that are happening at UNMC, Midtown Crossing, the Ritzon Gardens, Holland Center. There's some just amazing donors and legacies that are being, left to our community for the generations to come. What about the streetcar and some of the rail actually also being a legacy that connects legacies together? And that, coupled with then additional private development, I think really creates, a community for us all to be proud of and encourages developers to develop around that.
I would add about the rents part that when I was trying to touch on it in my long dissertation a second ago, but we can reevaluate exactly what these projects are because of the BRT and because of the streetcar, and put more units in less space with less parking. Parking is very expensive to build, and it doesn't pay as well as building a residence. So, instead of 100 units and 100 stalls, I could build 120 units and 10 stalls, or less stalls.
And let's not forget that parking's expensive to build, but it's expensive to maintain.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
So, kind of going on that parking discussion, full disclosure, I worked for Mike for a year and was part of finding parking for these projects that we were putting together, and finding, a few stalls here and a few stalls there, and hey, can we, where can we eke out parking for our residents? And one of the conversations, or one of the topics that you bring up, Mike, is, improving our public transportation system means potentially building fewer parking stalls for each unit, thereby, obviously changing your returns and the money that you're putting into that. Can you talk at all about that?
Well, I'm glad that was the best year of your life, Zach. That was very nice of you to say.
It was fantastic.
That was great. Thanks. A couple years ago, we built the Paxton, and we had some additional parking stalls. And we sat on them, and they weren't full for a while. And then some things changed overnight. There are office users moving downtown, and literally overnight, all the stalls were gone around the Paxton area. So when you look at that big map of where all these stalls are downtown, if I am going to office up by the Ameritrade Park, and I'm parking down at the other end of town, that's not working. So it's balancing these and moving people, closer to their where they need to have the stalls. So we really did struggle trying to find all these parking stalls and make that happen. Sorry, I forgot where I was going. The whole thing. What was the?
Oh, your investment in these projects, does it change the way that you look at projects if you don't have to build two
Yes,
stalls per unit.
Exactly. So, and that's so that was what happened around the Paxton, and then all the parking was gone, and it's been a real detriment to getting some of the other spaces leased, and not only residentially but on the commercial office side. So then when we moved over and we're doing the Capital District, it is a whole different ballgame because you have to share parking. Because everybody's needs, you can't build them all. We could never build for the $250 million to self-park ourselves. And so we've been able to take advantage of the fact that there's the UP garage, which is basically open at night, and some of the other garages in the area, and we planned for those. We've hardly built any retail parking in the Capital District because there is so much available and what's going on in the area. So we are definitely looking at it differently. We got to be a little bit careful, though, because people are still not, there's an education element here that it is a science, and if people do look at the calculations and the numbers, you don't need to build the stalls, but still a lot of people are wary and say, well, build them for me anyways. So then you got a physical problem. Capitol Street could end up looking like a large parking garage from 10th to, or at least 11th to 16th Street if we're not careful, with a lot of overbuilt parking garages that we can't afford to pay and maintain.
That's great. Other cities have seen sort of success with streetcar, and the success is sort of, my understanding is that the success is sort of seen as being a part of higher density, mixed use developments, traffic throughout the day. It kind of drives that success. We're talking about Kansas City, the success that they've seen. What might that look like for Omaha? You know, you talked about $1 billion in development for Kansas City already. What might that look like for Omaha?
Maybe just because I work for the city and have been, and from Omaha, I think we actually have the best route in both BRT and it'll be improved over time, but the best route in urban circulator. There are 3 or 4 distinct places along the proposed urban circulator route that can be game changers, that add that density that we haven't seen in Omaha, and it has the potential, even above and beyond what S.P. Friedman showed, to go above that $1 billion in development, that additional new development. This is new development. This isn't rehab projects or adaptive reuse of projects, so that's new development. So one specific area to look at is west of City Hall on the long blocks in that area. We're seeing some development now and new projects that came online, but in that area, you'll see it'll be transformed overnight. As a planner, we look 30 years down the road, so for me it's tough to tell my family what I do and describe that as a planner, but so we're always looking down the road for the city, so those corridors will look totally and entirely different with these projects coming online, as well as North Downtown. We showed the picture of North Downtown. That has always been seen as an area of dense development. Lincoln kind of got ahead of us with what they've done around Pinnacle Arena down there, but I see that very similar thing happening in Omaha, and probably better, and that's what we need. We have some people up there that have pioneered with their developments, and they need some neighbors, and these projects will do that. We'll bring those neighbors, we'll bring that density that we need, and also we'll bring that one side of things that we don't see today is that retail. We've had some developers that have done a lot of multifamily units just around City Hall, and there's not a lot of retail to go with it, not a lot of services for those residents, and unless we get more dense, you're not going to see that retail. So I think that's a key factor in all of this, and it gets back to that whole idea again. What I mentioned earlier is vibrancy. So again, I think we have one of the best routes. One of the best routes that's coming online here nationally is in Detroit. Look at that project, and then it's Kansas City. It's a long linear route, and get down to Kansas City. The tracks are going in the ground right now. The BRT's been up and running for quite some time, but we'll see similar to development that they have, but probably better. And maybe I'm biased a little bit.
You know, as I sat here, something occurred to me, asking would it make a difference in development. My partner Scott and I are working on a project right now at 30th and St. Mary. There's a triangle there at Leavenworth, 30th, and St. Mary. And if we think about parking, even from an architectural perspective, parking is one building type. And so let's think about podium garages, wood frame on top of a podium garage. if we weren't contending with a parking issue right now, or how we're going to park cars and pay to park cars, the project would already be being built. So the economic development would already be happening right there. But it's how do we go pay $25,000 per stall for a parking garage? That part of the math doesn't work. And actually, as I said, I'm thinking, for the last 5 months, that's all we've looked at. As soon as we start stacking the wood frame construction on top, it's, the economics start to work. And so if there was a stop there and we weren't necessarily having to contend with as much parking, we'd already be building. So, how could it not be an economic stimulus is what's going through my head.
There was a slide earlier that showed that without any of this, there could be $1 billion of development in this corridor, and by adding the BRT, added another 300 some odd $1 million, and then adding the streetcar, it doubles it to $2 billion, and that's factual studies. I don't know if that falls into the same, but the point is, it's gone through the science of trying to calculate it in other markets where that's been proven. And the other thing is, originally, if you go back to where the trolley was going north and south, connecting the zoo to downtown, now what it's doing, it's and I'm going to ask if this is a good analogy, but we're investing into a successful corridor already to make it more efficient, faster, better, and stronger, similar to putting in the Dodge Street overpass from 120th out to, it really made a lot of additional development occur along Dodge much more quickly and better and stronger. And so I don't know if it's exact correlation, but the point is that it's with the densities that occur down here, this is the only direction. You can't make Dodge Street any bigger. You can't make it faster. It has to be an alternative, which is maybe where the word came from. I don't know.
Great. So I heard you bring it up, Mike, and Jerry, I think you've touched on it. The idea of perception and connecting legacies, and from a cultural standpoint, a battle that some people have with public transportation, or a perception issue that public transportation has, is that it's, either a service for the low income, or something that people can't rely on. How do the proposals sort of address that perception problem? Because it's my understanding that it may not actually be the way that people perceive it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think perception really is kind of the key word there. I bet you a lot of people don't know that actually Metro is carrying over 4 million trips a year right now on our current system. And we have express routes like the Express 92 that goes out to Village Point that actually has standing room only on the bus every day. But you're right, there is a perception in some communities, and really it's all about how we build these projects and build partnerships in building these projects. They're going to be the high end, full of amenities. There's the branding that we talked about earlier, and that sense of permanency and just the technology implementation, just the premium product, and making sure we're sharing with the community really what these products are for both BRT and streetcar.
And I could add to that, talking with people in Omaha since I've been with the city for 9 years now, transit has become a big issue, and a lot more people are requesting that we have better transit. We have a lot of boomerangers and transplants from other communities, kids that went away and came back, and they lived in other places where there's great transit, and they're desiring transit. And this whole idea of bad perception about transit is a national issue. It's not an Omaha issue at all, and it's a public resource that we desperately need, and we need to continue to enhance it and add to it, because if we don't, we're going to lose a lot of our talent. We're not going to be able to retain our talent that we have, and we'll have talent that'll move away or won't even come here. And there's a lot of stories I hear about people talking about this very issue. And I think the more that we could talk about transit in the community and the value that it adds, because it does add capacity to our transportation system. And some people, when they say that transit's got a perception issue in Omaha, I just ask them have they ridden the bus lately, and they usually say no. And if I ask riders that ride it every day, they love it. It's a great service to them. So I think the conversation needs to be brought to a broader level in our community, and for our community to understand what transit is. So I think through those conversations, and just maybe I'm optimistic, but the last many years, more and more people are talking about transit. And it goes right with what this summit's all about. It's about retaining talent and attracting talent, and if we don't change, we're not going to be competitive. And this is a regional type issue that we have to take on. And the more people that understand this, the more competitive we'll be in the future. So it's something that we have to change the minds in Omaha about transit.
So I have some questions, but I do want to open it up to the floor if there are anybody that out there that has questions that we haven't addressed or concerns or want more information. I'd love to open it up. Yeah, what do you got?
Ken and Jerry, how are you going to balance the next 2 decades of development happening along the corridor versus the current parking needs that are going to go with that development versus maybe developers' desire to say, I don't want to provide 4 to 1, I want to provide 2 to 1, and the city saying, well, it's not code, and what do you have off street, and how does Jerry do his development at 30th and St. Mary's without the parking? And then further, Jerry, would you go without the parking? Because could you lease it without the parking?
Well, go ahead and jump in, but I would say, first of all, we probably need to identify the efficiencies within the garages and the system we have now, because there is adequate supply of parking. And I'm speaking to developers that probably don't see that on my end, but there is a connection between the transportation and parking, and the elements is being able to offer the employees the option of, I want to pay $100 a month for parking, I'll pay $60, I'll walk a few blocks, or maybe I want to jump on that bus or the rail system out there in front of my office. So I think it's all kind of intertwined, and we'll have to figure out that balance as we move ahead. And I think the first step is going to be figuring out the parking system. We're going to have to do something with our on-street, because right now we're encouraging people to just keep circling the block and looking for that space. But we got to figure out the off-street too. So if we're going to displace people from the on-street, we got to figure out the off-street. So it's got to be a balanced approach to that.
So, it's interesting. I actually think the city is more gracious to the urban developers about what the parking count requirement needs to be than the developers themselves are willing. I think we're probably still a little old school, and we want all our parking, and we, frankly, I probably wouldn't build a project on 30th and St. Mary's with no parking. The point I would make, though, if there was parking or there were transportation alternatives, then I would probably start to shift my mindset, especially if I'm seeing the market changes. Something that occurred to me from a kind of a total cost of ownership perspective, just, unfortunately I have to live within my means and a budget. And I think about traveling to another city. If I'm going to go to a city and it's got some good transit, a little trolley, I'll actually stay in a more expensive hotel. Because at some point I can only spend so much for my travel on that trip. But if I'm going to have to rent a car, then I'm going to probably stay at the Courtyard Marriott, because then it's a little bit less expensive hotel. So even the guests that come to our city and the choices that they're going to make and the type of hotels they'd want to stay in, there's kind of this total cost of ownership. So as we start to look at the total pie, parking downgrades our hotels. Parking can really start to change what type of amenities we select, because we've got to go pay for that piece to get around.
Just to add to that, and I mentioned, I talked about the downtown plan, and the plan itself by 2030 shows, in addition with the alternatives analysis, what we did the financial analysis with that, shows $3 billion in new development. Without more enhanced transit in the downtown area, the city or other partners would have to spend over $1 billion just on parking. And if it's the city that's doing that, that's the city that's the taxpayers that's subsidizing that, besides the use fees and basically the payments on that. And Kent can probably talk more about this than I can, but to me that's a big dollar figure just on parking. And you think about that, that's valued at a lot less if it's a public garage, or it's not valued at all. So as far as the tax base and growing the tax base, that's a pretty big deal. So just think about that for just downtown, and hopefully we can spread development with greater densities outside of downtown. But the amount of money that's spent on parking, it frustrates the city, it frustrates developers that do work in the downtown and midtown area. And I don't know if we want to, as a community, continue to pay those amounts of money, pay that amount of money in the future. And is that really sustainable financially?
with the systems, it spreads it all out a little bit too. Somebody might still have a car, but they might be taking the BRT to work, so they park a block or two away. These guys might not want to build the parking there, or not build the project without the parking today, but if it's there and the rails are on the ground, it's about redevelopment too. This Kansas City, the $1 billion is not just empty farmland. They're taking down other buildings and building more units, and it's talk about a reinvestment, which ultimately always gets to the bottom of the tax base as well. More tax base.
Anybody else out there have any questions or? Yeah.
For Lauren, do you have the discretion to pick the right vehicle that looks less like a bus and more like a train?
Yes, and that's something we're certainly looking at. The project is in project development now, and that's something we'll be looking at is the vehicle specifications as well as the fuel propulsion for the vehicles based on capacity. But I mean, we do have to work with what transit vehicles are currently being made. We're not going to design a new one, but definitely the idea is to really have them a higher end appearance to them. And there's quite a few different varieties out there, especially in the front end and what they can look like.
Yeah, you showed a lot of examples with some that look like a bus and some that look like a train. And if it looks like a bus, I don't think it'll work.
Yeah, and that's something we're certainly looking at is that aesthetics of that vehicle. That's a good point.
I saw some other hands. Yeah.
So I'm someone, my husband works downtown, he's paid $100 a month, parked in those garages for years. And I know in our situation, there's some days that or months that he might only park it 5-6 days of that month. He would still pay probably $100 a month to park those 5 or 6 days. But have you ever gone to the individual employee level to say, hey, would you rent or post your stall when you're not using it? Like they won't give it up, but
I can't address that the most.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on what the shared parking model.
I'm grabbing the mic. Sorry.
You're hitting upon what the shared parking model is really about, is creating those efficiencies within those systems. Over time, you can figure out where those trends are. You can start figuring out, we call it diversity calculation within the garages, and you really start determining what's happening there. And being that this is a parking revenue fund, it's eventually going to be generating revenues that could go to support other developments or go to support other transportation. So, yeah, there's certainly times like that. You're going to have to set up different systems. You have to identify your users. Right now, we just said it's a $100 space, and that's what we've limited ourselves to, that type of management, and we got to change that perspective. So.
Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. It is, right now we're in the environmental review process and just about to start preliminary design. So I can't say with 100% certainty, but it is being planned to be primarily within the existing right-of-way.
Will it be a dedicated lane for BRT only? Or will they be competing with the cars?
It's going to be a combination. The western portion of the route will be mixed traffic with some preferential treatment at intersections and red lights to allow for the BRT vehicle to gain that speed and efficiency. There will be some business access and transit-only lanes, which are semi-exclusive, and then we're also looking at about a mile and a half of exclusive guideway for the BRT vehicle.
Sure.
The total project cost right now, the high-level budget's about $30 million. And we have federal funding for about 80% of that. So there is a local match requirement for all federal funds.
Omaha has two major bus companies. One, of course, is MAT, and the other one, of course, is Omaha Public Schools. In St. Paul, Minnesota, the public transportation up there blends some of their routes together with the schools in an effort to be more efficient and more productive. And I was just wondering, has there been any interplay or any action between the Omaha Public Schools and the
Absolutely. OPS is a stakeholder on all of our studies and plans. The regional transit vision study that Jeff talked about that actually identified the urban circulator and BRT project as well as future projects, they were a major stakeholder on that as well as consulted throughout the process. And we work closely with them on school special events and IDs for students and try to maximize those efficiencies.
Yeah, bring it.
Past month, I've been coming downtown and I see the pay your parking fee with my phone, but I can't find anybody that knows how to do it.
I think if you connect with Ken, he can help you with that.
Yes, look me up afterwards and I'll help you out. But we're creating a new website, as I mentioned, the comprehensive website for parking information. And we hope to have videos or other things that will kind of give instruction to how to do some of those things. So. That's what we like.
That's a success, I think.
That's success.
Yeah. So if there are any other questions, if there aren't any other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you guys for coming. Thanks to the panel for being here.
Jeff, Charlie Boone. A million years ago. But yeah, I didn't know you were doing that. Great job. So how long did you Same thing. But yeah, I don't. So yeah, same thing. Yeah, when I saw you up here, I thought, oh, that's interesting.
I've learned how to do pro forma.
That's. I imagine you run a lot of different iterations.